So at least once or twice a week, people ask me online, in person, something, gee, can you help me? Can you give me some advice with some emotional problem I'm having? And generally the answer is no. Excuse me. The answer is no. And the answer is not no because, I'm afraid of getting sued or those kind of things that you might think of. The answer is no because emotional problem is just kind of a general thing, even when it's a specific symptom. And so I want to talk a little bit about emotional problems, and I want to talk a little bit about symptoms today, and really explain kind of what goes on here and how to think about this in a different way. So maybe you can solve some of your own emotional problems. Okay, I'm Stephen Brownlow. I'm the founder of Adept Psychology. I'm the author of Emotions in Psychology and Psychotherapy. And one way that I'd like to think about symptoms, and an example I want to give you because I think it's a really good one. Before we really understood much about modern medicine, we understood that when people aren't doing well, there's sort of two symptoms that occur over and over. One is pain, and the other is fever. Well, pain could be, it could be a ruptured appendix. It could be a superficial strain, a muscle strain of some kind, or maybe a light sunburn that will give you pain. Well, clearly those are very different things. Fever was maybe more extreme. They knew that when people had fever, they died, but they didn't really know why people had fever. Well, over time, and humans have been around, I guess Homo sapiens have been around a couple 100,000 years. There are other humanoid kind of hominids, I guess they call them, that have been around maybe 2-3 million years. And there are other animals, and clearly they have fevers and stuff too. But so we've had this history of fevers. And, okay, if you get attacked by an animal and you get gored by the animal, then you develop a fever. Well, that's not a good thing. And, and as it turns out, pretty much any of your internal organs, if they start leaking into the body for whatever reason, whether it's your intestines or your pancreas or your liver, or your gallbladder, or whatever, you're going to have pain and you're going to have fever. But then there were a lot of other reasons that people had fever, and it wasn't clearly known why people had these other fevers. But they knew that if they didn't do something about the fever, the person was going to die, and even if they tried to, they died, usually because they didn't really have effective medicine, a few thousand years ago. And so there were all these fevers. They were just known as fevers. And there's still some of that in English. We still talk about yellow fever and scarlet fever and dengue fever and all these different kinds of fevers because nobody knew what caused them. Maybe it was spirits, maybe it was demons or something. Maybe it was fate. Who knows? Something caused fevers. Well, then they invented the microscope a few hundred years ago, and they started looking at stuff, and sure enough, then they found bacteria, and then they found viruses, and it's like, oh, these are the things that have been causing the fevers. And now they know how to deal with fever, okay? And it's not like, oh, we're dealing with fever. It's like, no, we're dealing with the malaria. We're dealing with the measles. We're dealing with whatever it is that's causing the fever. So fever is a symptom, but fever is a very nonspecific symptom. It's a symptom that covers a lot of different physical ailments. Well, emotional problems is also pretty nonspecific. And there's a few things that can cause emotional problems. In general, emotional problems are caused by not paying attention to what's important to you. not paying attention to what's really going on with you. Now, you can not pay attention to what's really going on with you and not necessarily have an emotional problem. I mean, you can just do all sorts of stuff to distract yourself, and you're going to be pretty unhappy. You're going to be pretty unfulfilled, but you're not necessarily going to have an emotional problem the way I'm talking about it here. But in terms of the kinds of emotional problems that people clearly say, I'm having an emotional problem, they're really four things. There are four variations that I see over and over again. So I want to talk about that real briefly here. So the first variation is that people are scared of how they feel. And so what they do is they focus, and it's not always fear. It could be they're maybe embarrassed by how they feel. And so you have somebody who's, for instance, they got bad news, or something. The world told them no somehow. Maybe they had a relationship and the person broke up with them. So they're maybe embarrassed about how sad they feel. They're embarrassed about caring. They're worried that they're going to cry in front of other people, and other people are going to think they're weak or something like this. And so they worry about the wrong thing. They focus on the wrong thing. Instead of focusing on the sadness, because they were told no and that's a loss, they focus on the embarrassment or fear or whatever. Okay, so, and I'm just going to say, most of the time when you hear people, it's like, oh, I don't do things because of fear. That's really what's going on. They're not afraid of wild animals. They're not afraid of the dark. They're afraid of feeling something that they'd rather not feel. So that's kind of one level of emotional problem, but that's pretty easy to solve. And then there's a second level. And again, this one's also it's a little tougher, but it's basically the same person. Maybe they had the breakup, they feel sad. Instead of focusing on how I feel, I focus on you. And I blame you because you broke up with me. And so now I'm angry. And so I'm just angry instead of sad. Well, the sadness, I'm feeling sad, but I'm putting out anger on you, but the sadness still comes out, and it comes out is some kind of a mixture of anger and sadness. And so you get maybe frustration or bitterness or something, argumentative behavior, something, hostility. And I put that out instead of putting out the sadness. Well, now that's a second kind of emotional problem where it's sort of I'm putting out my stuff about you instead of sweeping my own side of the street. So that's number two. Now the third one is actually stuff that I make up. And typically this is stuff that I've been making up a long time. I mean, kids, clue you in if you haven't realized it, kids all learn to lie. And the first thing they learn to lie about is how they feel. It's like pretty early when they're maybe 2 years old, they realize I don't have to act the way I really feel. I can act these other ways because if I act these other ways, maybe I can get my way. So, we break up, same example, I'm feeling sad. Instead of, admitting I feel really sad, I feel lonely, I feel desperate, I feel whatever, I start acting like maybe I feel hurt. Maybe if I act hurt, then you'll feel sorry for me and you'll come back. Or I can find some other way to act insecure or something like that, and maybe you'll love me, or somebody will love me, somebody will take me in because they'll see me as this person who's just too weak to handle myself on my own, and they'll feel sorry for me and take care of me, and I won't have to feel sad. Okay, so that's a third kind of emotional problem, and once again, it's because I'm not focusing. Instead of focusing on sad, I'm focusing on feeling pathetic or whatever. And I can even convince myself I'm pathetic And I can try to convince you I'm pathetic, but mostly what I'm going to convince you is that I'm kind of overacting. Or I can just be, another example of that is I can be real assertive and sort of demanding. I can demand that people give me my way and whatever and try to come in and be all controlling and stuff like this. And because by God, I deserve this, and you're being so unfair, and all this nonsense. And again, it strikes people as really, overdone, because it is overdone. And now, obviously, this can overlap with the second one I talked about with the anger, but it's, and the point of this is not that these are clear distinctions, but it's like these are sort of patterns. So that's the third pattern. Okay, so we have the first one is sort of how we feel about it. The second one is sort of how we feel about the other person. And then the third one is sort of how we pretend to feel. And now the fourth pattern is maybe it's not my feeling at all, ever. Maybe I've been dealing with sadness for a long time, but maybe it wasn't mine. Maybe I'm carrying around somebody else's sadness. We all pick up on other people's emotions all the time. And sometimes, especially when we're kids, if we come from a family where there's a lot of sadness, then maybe we're carrying around sadness from other people. And maybe there's this whole kind of thing about how we just, in this family, we sort of don't handle sadness. We put it off. And because we're kind of sad to begin with and we're looking sad, other people are more likely to leave us, and we're more likely to react in a really sad way. But it may not be my sadness. It may be somebody else's sadness. But again, that's keeping me from dealing with my own stuff. I'm dealing with other people's stuff instead. So those are sort of four ways that we distract ourselves. Now there's a fifth pattern, and it happens. It could be that it is my sadness, but it's not my sadness about this. It's my sadness from way back. Something happened years and years ago, and I never sort of properly grieved it. And so anytime somebody tells me no, or somebody leaves me or rejects me or whatever, I go back into that spiral again with all the unresolved grief from before. And that's the one, and that happens. We assume a lot of times wrongly that that's what's going on. And it really, like I say, it happens, but it's not what's happening all the time. And I'm going to say it's not even what's happening most of the time. Most of the time, it's those other four that I talked about. So those are sort of the patterns that we go through. And so when you think about how do you deal with this emotional problem, and somebody may have a very specific thing. Well, whenever this comes up, I feel this, or I have this problem that's been keeping me going, and they have an entire elaborated stories about their problem. And it's like, what is your advice? Gee, I don't know. It's more a question of what caused it. Which of these patterns is it? Because what works with something I'm making up is not going to work with somebody else's stuff. And what works with somebody else's stuff is not going to work with my old stuff. And what works with my old stuff is not going to work with my fear of something that I don't want to deal with right now, or my embarrassment of dealing with something right now. Everything that you work with, it's pretty straightforward, but they all have sort of different ways of dealing with it. And so emotional problems, just saying emotional problems is like saying fever. You're not going to be able to just deal with it that simply. You have to know what it is that you're actually dealing with and how it started. So I'm Dr. Stephen Brownlow. And if you learned something here, scroll down. leave me a message. Let's have a conversation about this. My sense is that most people find that they get this wrong an awful lot. Most of the stuff that we see as sort of long-term emotional problems is not that people want to have emotional problems. It's that people get confused about what to do. They hear something worked, or maybe something worked for them once with an emotional problem, and they try it again and it doesn't work. But it's because it's a different kind of emotional problem, or a different cause of emotional problem, even if it looks exactly the same. So think about it, work with it, and just remember, it's inside you. The power to deal with this, the power to change your life is yours. It's not mine. It's not anybody else's. It's yours. If you need help, ask, but take the power yourself.